Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Global Geopolitics. Sunday, July 26. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. There's a detail buried in the reporting from these last 2 days that, on its own, looks like a footnote, the kind of thing you'd skim past on your way to the headline. American air strikes against Iran have paused. Not because of a ceasefire, not because of diplomacy, not because of some grand strategic recalculation in a wood-paneled room. They've paused, according to the reporting, because Washington is running low on Patriot interceptors and air defense munitions. The stockpile is dwindling, and so the bombing stops not when the political will runs out, but when the inventory does. Now hold that thought, because I want to place it next to something that at first glance has nothing to do with it. On the same weekend, more than 340,000 people were evacuated from wildfires across France and Spain. Fire whirlwinds near Bordeaux, 2 blazes merging into one monster outside Madrid. The Tour de France, that great annual ritual of national self-image, shortened not for security, not for protest, but because the emergency services were needed elsewhere. And a wildfire researcher, asked why this keeps happening, gives the answer nobody wants on a summer broadcast. The fire season is now longer nearly everywhere. Here is the connection a casual reader of the news will miss. Both of these stories are stories about the exhaustion of buffers, about the moment when the reserve, the thing you were quietly counting on to absorb the shock, turns out to be finite and closer to empty than anyone admitted. The great illusion of the modern state is that it has slack. That behind every crisis there is a deeper reservoir, more missiles in the magazine, more firefighters to redeploy, more helicopters, more money, more time before the next thing hits. The whole architecture of deterrence and disaster response rests on this quiet promise of depth. And what this weekend reveals, if you read it sideways, is that the depth is being spent. The most powerful military on Earth is rationing its own defensive munitions in the middle of a live campaign. The wealthiest bloc of nations on the continent is moving cyclists off the road because it cannot fight the fires and stage the spectacle at once. These are not stories of collapse. They are stories of stretch of systems discovering their own edges, and that, I'd argue, is where our whole domain now stands. We have spent a generation talking about geopolitics as a contest of intentions. Who wants what? Who is bluffing? Whose red lines are real? But look at what actually filled the wires this weekend, and you'll notice how much of it is a contest of capacities instead of throughput, of supply, of whether the physical stuff arrives in time. The Houthis fire at Saudi oil facilities along the Red Sea, and the question is not really about grievance, which is old, but about reach and resupply. A tanker is boarded and disabled for allegedly breaking the Iran blockade. That's not diplomacy, that's logistics enforced with a gun. Even the strangest item of the weekend, Iran accusing Ukraine of bombing one of its commercial vessels in the Caspian Sea, tells you that the conflict has metastasized into the plumbing of global trade. The ships and the sea lanes, the invisible arteries we assume will simply keep flowing. Notice, too, how the map refuses to stay tidy. A war that began as a bilateral affair now has a Yemeni front, a Caspian front, a Gulf debate about how not whether to end it, with Arab states quietly discovering they don't agree. The old vocabulary of theaters and spheres assumes conflicts have edges. What we're watching has no clean edge. It leaks. And running underneath all of it, like a second baseline, is a category of threat that treats our borders and alliances as irrelevant. The fires don't check passports. Typhoon now making landfall in Guangdong, hundreds of thousands moved. Floods, earthquakes, the slow grinding recovery Venezuela now faces in the tens of billions. These are not geopolitical events in the traditional sense. No one declared them, no one can sue for peace. But they draw down exactly the same reserves that statecraft relies on. The helicopter fighting a fire in the lands is a helicopter not available for anything else. Security and climate are now competing for the same finite bucket. So here is the argument I want to build with you over the next while. First, that the true measure of power in this moment is not ambition, but resilience, the depth of the reserve, and the honesty with which a nation counts it. Second, that our threats have converged. The man-made and the natural now pull on a single, shared, shrinking supply of capacity, attention, and money. And third, the most uncomfortable one, that the stories we tell about geopolitics, the stories of will and cunning and resolve, may be flattering distractions from the humbler truth that everything runs out. The bombs run out. The firefighters run out. And the state that survives the coming decades will be the one that stopped pretending otherwise. Let's begin there. If you take the day's headlines and lay them side by side, they arrange themselves at first into the usual disorder. A van driven into a crowd of celebrants in a Berlin park. Fire whirls near Bordeaux. Tens of thousands fleeing the hills west of Madrid. A goalkeeper of 40 signing for a Chilean club. A former president's son launching a campaign with endorsements from abroad. Boxing, tear gas. A summoned diplomat. It has the texture of pure chaos, one thing after another, none of it obviously connected. And that is exactly the illusion I want to resist. Because underneath the churn there runs a deep current, and once you feel it, the noise begins to sort itself. Consider the fires first, because they are the clearest tell. 340,000 people evacuated across France and Spain. Blazes near Madrid and Toledo that firefighters are praying will not join up into one continuous wall, because two fires that merge do not simply add their strength, they multiply it, generating their own weather, their own winds, those whirlwinds of flame that behave less like a fire and more like a storm. A typhoon making landfall in Guangdong, a village burning in West Java. And a researcher who studies wildfire for a living saying, almost wearily, that the fire season now stretches longer nearly everywhere. That last phrase is the deep current in miniature. Not this fire, not this heatwave, the lengthening of the season itself. The baseline is moving. What we once called an emergency is quietly becoming the climate we live in, and the machinery of response, the firefighters, the evacuation orders, even the shortening of a bicycle race so ambulances can get through, is straining against a load that is no longer episodic. It is structural. Now hold that idea, a system absorbing more stress than it was built for, and turn it toward the human conflicts, because the same pattern is written there in a different hand. The war involving the United States and Iran has been running through nightly bombardment, and then suddenly a pause, not because anyone decided peace was wise. The reporting suggests something far more mundane and far more revealing. The stockpiles of interceptors, the patriots and their kin, are running low. The fighting slows not from restraint, but from arithmetic. Munitions are finite. Factories run at a certain pace. And so even the mightiest military in the world discovers that its capacity to sustain intensity has a flaw beneath which the whole enterprise must throttle back. That is the same shape as the fire season, only inverted. In one case the pressure is rising, in the other the capacity is depleting. Either way, a system meets its limit. And watch how a conflict, once lit, refuses to stay contained. The Houthis firing at Saudi oil facilities along the Red Sea. A new front opening on the Caspian, where Iran accuses Ukraine of striking one of its vessels. A tanker boarded and disabled for allegedly running a blockade. Each of these is a spark thrown from the main blaze, landing somewhere dry, catching. This is what conflict does at scale, like those two fires near Madrid. It seeks to merge. The great fear among the firefighters and the great fear among the diplomats turns out to be identical, that the separate blazes will join into one. The Gulf states, we are told, all want the war to end, and yet cannot agree on how. That sentence is the tragedy of collective action rendered in a single line. Everyone can see the fire. No one can agree who holds the hose. So what is the deep current? I would put it this way. Across climate, across warfare, across politics, we are watching the exhaustion of buffers. The margins that used to absorb shocks, the cool nights that ended a fire season, the reserves that let a nation fight without counting, the norms that kept a mosque or a pride march or a hospital outside the circle of targets, those margins are thinning. When a man drives into a crowd of celebrants, when settlers burn a place of worship, when tear gas is turned on the journalists sent to record it, you are seeing the erosion of the invisible restraints that once held. And when politics reaches across borders for endorsement, one nation's candidate blessed by leaders of others, you see borders themselves becoming more porous to the movement of grievance and alignment. None of this is destiny. A buffer thinned is not a buffer gone. But the honest observer notices the direction of travel. The season is longer nearly everywhere. The stockpile is not infinite. The fires want to join. And the work of our moment, the deeply unglamorous, unheadlined work, is the rebuilding of margin, the interceptor that is never fired because deterrence held, the firebreak cut in winter, the norm defended before it is tested. These things make no news. Their absence, we are learning, makes all of it. But we come to the part where we try to make sense of it, not the events themselves, which by now you've heard described in some detail, but the shape they trace when you stand back far enough to lose the individual outlines. And I want to be careful here, because the temptation with any day's news is to knit it into a grand unifying theory, to declare that everything is connected, and that the connection proves whatever you already believed on Tuesday. That's not the exercise. The exercise is subtler. It's to ask which of these strands are load-bearing, which will still be exerting pressure on the world a year from now, and which are simply loud. Consider the wildfires first, because they are the clearest case of a second-order story hiding inside a first-order one. The immediate story is fire. France and Spain together, evacuating well north of 300,000 people, fire whirls near Bordeaux, blazes threatening the outskirts of Madrid, the final stage of a bicycle race shortened so that emergency crews aren't stretched to breaking. That's the spectacle. But the researcher who studies these things put his finger on the thing that actually matters when he observed that fire seasons are lengthening nearly everywhere. Lengthening. Not intensifying in a single dramatic summer, but stretching at both ends, quietly, year on year, until the exceptional becomes the baseline. That's the second-order implication that no single evacuation notice can convey. The question to watch is not how many hectares burned this weekend, but what it does to the machinery of a modern state when the emergency footing stops being seasonal and becomes structural. Firefighting budgets, insurance markets, water rights, the redrawing of where people can plausibly live, these are the slow consequences, and they don't produce dramatic footage until it's rather too late to plan for them. When you see a beloved sporting event yield ground to fire logistics, you're watching a small preview of a large negotiation between ordinary life and a changing climate. Watch for that negotiation to become explicit in budgets and building codes. Then there is the harder register, the register of political violence. A car driven into a crowd at a pride event in Berlin, 1 dead, 16 hurt, a suspect described by police as belonging to the city's Islamist scene. Settlers burning a mosque near Nablus while forces conduct mass arrests across the West Bank. These are not the same event, and I resist any equivalence between them. But they share a mechanism worth naming, violence aimed less at a target than at an audience. The purpose of ramming a pride march is not tactical, it is symbolic, meant to make a category of people feel that their visibility is a provocation. The purpose of torching a place of worship is to make a population feel that its presence on the land is contingent. What you watch for here is the response, because in both cases the perpetrator is, in a sense, placing a bet on the reaction. The bet is that fear will do the work, that a society will police itself into smallness. The second-order question is whether institutions hold their nerve, whether Berlin marches next year, whether the arrests of Israelis protesting settler violence in Tel Aviv signal a state confronting its own extremists or shielding them. Symbolic violence is defeated not by counter-symbolism, but by ordinariness resumed. Watch for the ordinariness. And then the widest strand, the one with the most contagion in it, the war involving the United States and Iran, and how it refuses to stay in its lane. A pause in nightly strikes attributed not to diplomacy, but to dwindling stocks of interceptor missiles. That detail is worth more than a dozen communiques, because it tells you that even the most powerful actor is spending down a finite resource, and that arithmetic, not intention, may end up dictating the tempo. Meanwhile, the conflict metastasizes, Houthis striking Saudi oil facilities, a new front opening, Iran accusing Ukraine of sinking one of its vessels in the Caspian, which is a geography most people had filed under distant. And the Gulf states, we are told, want the war ended but cannot agree on how, which is the perennial condition of coalitions, wanting the same destination and no two of them the same road. The second-order implication is the one that ought to keep planners awake. Wars that spread do so through opportunists, through actors who see a distracted giant and place their own bets. Watch the munitions arithmetic, watch the price of oil when a Red Sea facility burns, and watch whether that Caspian accusation is a genuine grievance or a pretext being warmed up for later use. What ties all of this together isn't a theme, it's a tempo. Each of these systems, climate, social cohesion, geopolitics, is being asked to absorb shocks faster than it was designed to. The signal ahead, then, is a simple discipline: distinguish the noise of any given weekend from the slow variables underneath. The slow variables are always the ones that win. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming. We'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.